Okay. Okay. So we already spoke a little bit about trauma and intergenerational trauma and kind of like the effects that that can have on the body, and not only our trauma, but the trauma of the people who came before us. So I would like to ask you, why do you think this is an important conversation to have?
Why do I think? Okay, well, thank you for asking the question. I think it's really important because it gives us context for things that standard medical Western science can't explain. So when we see rates of co-occurring conditions or comorbidity among certain BIPOC groups, for example, there's this idea that like, okay, BIPOC folk, and I'll take my own group, African Americans hypothetically, gravitate to issues of hypertension or diabetes, and it's just a given. But there's no context as to, well, why is that the case? It's not like people just one day wake up and say, oh, well, as a culture, we have this issue. What it really is a culmination, accumulation of factors that are stemming from intergenerational trauma that have not been addressed, that have landed in individuals in modern times, as well as other genetic factors, lifestyle factors, et cetera. So it's important, in my opinion, for us to understand the impact of intergenerational trauma, because when we look at current issues, if we don't understand what happened to us historically and within our families, then we can't understand why certain issues are occurring now. So let's return to the hypertension example. Hypertension, it's a blood pressure issue, right? It has to go with tension. A lot of that could stem from the fact that historically people have been traumatized who are, say, African American, due to the slave trade, due to slavery, due to convict leasing, due to Jim Crow, all these factors. All those factors have created anxiety, systematic depression, people, if we put it in a polyvagal term, people exiting their ventrivagal and going into somatic, and then certainly staying in dorsal. And it shows up physically, right? The body isn't separate from the mind or experiences. And as a result of it showing up physically, it often lands in this way of like, I'm constantly going to be under attack, therefore I'm constantly going to be tense. Therefore, that metabolizes as hypertension. And so then, because that form of intergenerational trauma hasn't been processed, it hasn't been addressed, it's just continued on for the several centuries, you get to 2023, and you could be a person who, say, has experienced, anytime you experience, say, discrimination when buying a home or renting a home, opening a bank account, being stopped by the police, just being called something on the street, right? It's not only hard on you individually, but all these other intergenerational experiences are then activated within you. And that can propel in my opinion, can propel issues of hypertension, for example. And so a person who could say, well, I'm pretty healthy, why do I have hypertension? Well, the answer, medical science will say, oh, it's because you're Black. Well, no, it's actually because you've had a history of intergenerational trauma that have created this in your background. And yes, you do have genetic factors, but this is what's been the catalyst for it. And your personal experiences are now kind of igniting it. That makes sense.
So in a way, it's inviting us to think about not only, I think it's very easy for some of us to understand that based on our own experiences, when we get triggered, it's because we're reliving that experience, right? So, okay, I am reliving this one experience that I lived, but now you're kind of adding one new layer to this, saying, well, it's not only your experiences, but the experiences of your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and everybody else who came before you, who have also been carrying all of these hardships, adversities, trauma within their background, which is a whole other issue to unpack, right? If dealing with our own trauma is already something.
I'll surrender.
¿Qué puede pasar? Ya no pasa nada. Una vida de mucho cambio, pero mucho cambio causado por mí. Salud mental, bienestar, salud física, emocional, a través de testimonios.
I'll surrender.
Surrender es aceptar la realidad.
Okay, so we'll get more into what this is all about, and I am very, very excited to hear you talk to us. And more specifically, I'm very interested in hearing how it is that you specifically, what were the things that happened in your life that led you to
Sure.
be so interested in intergenerational trauma,
Sure.
first off. But so welcome everyone to one more episode of Let's Surrender. I am Natalia Schlesinger, and Let's Surrender is a mental health awareness and wellness platform. We do interviews, workshops, and many, many other things around bringing awareness of the importance of taking care of our mental health and our well-being, and talking about the things that we usually don't want to talk about because they are uncomfortable. So today we have a very, very, very honored guest, and I am very happy, Lauren, to introduce you to our project. So I will let you introduce yourself to our audience, and that's that.
Thank you so much, Natalia, for having me here. My name is Lauren. My pronouns are she, her. I identify as an Afro-Indigenous person, so I'm African-American and Muskogee Creek in heritage. So if there are any Creeks out there, Hesche, Estengo. I'm learning my language through the tribe online, which is great, real connectivity. I am a licensed social worker, and currently I am completing a postgraduate fellowship through Women Care Counseling and Training Center in Evanston. And I am also a trauma therapist with Living Well Psychotherapy here in Evanston. So for my practice areas, I focus a lot on working with trauma survivors, specifically those who've survived domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and sexual assault. And the more I do this work, especially with people who come from marginalized groups, such as BIPOC, maybe people who've experienced genocide or their families have, LGBTQ, et cetera, the more I work with folks who've experienced trauma, the more I see that their identities often impact the trauma, in the sense that it's usually not an isolated event. It's not like I had one thing happen and I'm now traumatized. It's actually an accumulative event of I've had a lot of people not honor my intersectional identities. And then when we have those conversations, it often goes down to, well, what was your family of origin like? What happened there? And as we talk, what I've discovered is that there is a lot of historical trauma that impacts the current trauma. So what got me into it, going to your initial question of what got me into intergenerational trauma, was basically one, interest. I'm a history nerd, very proudly so. But two, intergenerational trauma impacts current trauma, and you cannot separate the two. If you want to heal from your current trauma, it often means looking at what happened to you or your family in the past, or your culture in the past, because those issues will impact you now. So my practice area does a lot of work, not just on direct trauma, as I named it, but intergenerational trauma, the trauma people who are out with intersectional identities face, the impact of implicit bias as well as explicit bias on individuals in their daily life, and employment trauma. And employment trauma actually fits in here because, again, a lot of people face discrimination on the job due to the identities they hold, which often plays into a lot of historical trauma that maybe people in their family have had with the concept of labor or capitalism or ideas of work. So that's my area of interest. I also identify as queer, and I am a brain tumor survivor. So I've had quite a bit of trauma on my own. I'm pretty upfront about all of this. So like a lot of people in our field, that also propelled me into wanting to do this type of work. So that's me in a nutshell. I don't know if there's anything else you want to hear.
Absolutely. I mean, we will hear a lot more from you in the several minutes to come. So thank you, Lauren, for sharing and being vulnerable and showing up to this space and sharing just a little tiny part of you with me this morning. And so I would like to ask you, so you were mentioned, we're talking about intergenerational trauma, and we're also talking about present and trauma that is happening today. And so to, I guess, get those two intertwined, we will have to go back in time a little bit, right? And so I would like to ask you, what was this first, or what were some of the first experiences in your life that you would now, looking back at, say, this was traumatic, and why?
Good question. Oh my gosh. I would say one of the most traumatic events in my life, when I think back, was actually the first time I was called the N-word. So, nigger. I was about 8 and I was at the library with my brother. We'd gone on our own. He was 9 or 10, walked by ourselves to the library just to get books. And as we were coming out of the library, there was a blue car. I remember this. And it was full of white cisgendered guys who called us nigger. They were like, hey, little niggers, do you want some candy? Hey, why don't you come to the car? Well, we didn't go to the car because we were taught we never go to a car with strangers, but we didn't know what the word meant. I had never heard that word before. And they were laughing and I was little. I'm like, oh, I guess it's a funny word. So then we went home. They didn't follow us or anything. They just said that and drove off. And so we went home and we told our mom, hey, we were called something today. And our mom, who was usually very enthusiastic and was like, oh, tell me what it is. We repeated the story. And of course, we saw her face drop. And being children, we're like, oh, what did we do wrong? And she was like, you didn't do anything wrong. That's a bad word for people who are Black. And she's like, and I'm sorry that was said for you. And she's like, now we have to talk about this word. So after reassuring us that it wasn't our fault, because when you're a child and your parent turns serious, you always think it's your fault. And now as an adult, I realized that word, of course, was very triggering to her life experiences. So she was bringing that energy in as well. It began a conversation of, well, some people here are not going to be okay with you just because of the color of your skin. And that was a very traumatic point for me because, one, it was the first time I realized being Black meant being different. I hadn't had that experience before. Like, I knew I was different from physically from my friends who were, say, white or Asian or Latino or Native or whatever, but it never occurred to me that, like, it was a barrier because my mom's an academic. I'd grown up in pretty progressive areas. So I hadn't experienced that. And then I remember being very confused, like, well, why would these random group of grownups want to say that to a bunch of kids? Like, why would they want to hurt our feelings? And, and she really couldn't give me an answer. And after that, my mom and my grandparents began starting to talk about our family history. And so I remember we watched this movie called The Liberators, which is an introduction through about slavery for children. And it's actually an excellent movie. It's a really good introduction if it's still out there. It came out in the 80s. And we watched that. And that was the first time I learned that my family had been enslaved, what that meant. I learned about the Underground Railroad. I was very disappointed to find out it didn't actually have trains. I won't lie. But anyway, I was like, what do you mean there are no actual trains? Anyway, but and I learned about that, how we came here. And then my grandmother is she's deceased, African-American in Muskogee Creek. And I knew we had a Native identity and we'd gone to a few powwows back then. They were held at like Navy Pier and UIC. And again, I never thought much of it other than like, hey, this is what we do, who doesn't have green onions with their scrambled eggs? That's a thing in my tribe. But then I realized, and so my grandmother then started talking to me about what many people refer to as the Trail of Tears. And she shared a story with me about her great-grandpa, from her great-grandpa that had been passed down, of when our family was forced to leave Georgia to go to Oklahoma. It was like an oral narrative about how these guys showed up with guns in Union outfits or soldier outfits and said, you got to walk. And she said that the story she'd been passed down generationally was, she said they were eating like oatmeal or porridge, and whatever ancestor had marched had been a child, and they were like, hey, I wonder what happened to my porridge. That's what they kept wondering. And this was like centuries and centuries ago, and the story had stayed. So I don't want to misrepresent. It was like a story passed down. So that was, again, another aspect of like, oh, my family has been, wasn't welcomed here. We were harmed. We either moved out or brought here. So then I remember what I now describe feeling kind of depressed, because I was like, well, that's really sad. And I kind of got nervous about reading about my history or becoming aware of it. So when we had a school project of talk about where your family came from, I remember my friends whose families came from Europe and had had more affirming experiences. Like a good friend of mine was Dutch and his family came here for the American dream. They were carpenters. Another good friend of mine in school was German and his family had come here. and they became lawyers. And I felt embarrassed to talk a little bit at first, because I'm like, what do I say? You know, my family, I found out, didn't come here. Some were already here and they were harmed. Others were made to come here and they were harmed. And I remember feeling almost guilty to what I would call now harsh everyone's buzz, you know, to say, like, this is my story. So from that experience, though, I became intrigued and wanted to learn more. And my grandparents are originally from the South. And if you're a listener who's from the South, you know, Southern grandparents love to tell stories of all kinds, and especially about family history. So in my family, I'm very fortunate. We have a lot of paintings and photos. I have 3 photos of 3 of my enslaved ancestors. I'm happy to share that with the podcast. And so I got to hear from my grandma and my grandpa on my mom's side, the narratives of these people. And because we had actual photos and we had their stories, I got to have a correction in my narrative. Instead of feeling depressed and guilty, I got to hear also about the resiliency and how my great-great-grandma, who had been a slave, also sent her kids when they were freed to the first historical Black colleges. And I got to hear about my great-great-great-grandfather who played a violin. And I got to hear so many empowering stories. So it began to balance it out of like, this wasn't our fault. It was traumatic. It wasn't our fault. It's a reality, but there's a lot of pride. And then as I got older and in life experienced certain traumas, particularly in college, that went beyond race. I'm a sexual assault survivor, and so forth. Part of my healing was learning that, one, sadly, like this, people, particularly I found at that time, cisgendered BIPOC women often have a higher rate of being harmed in life. So it helped me to feel a little less alone, even though it made me angry that we were targeted. So I don't, you know, it's a weird club to be part of.
100%. And I want us to kind of try to dissect a little bit of a lot of what you've said, because there's a lot of importance in a lot of what you said. So I do appreciate you sharing once more. And I think I hear a bunch of very important elements here, right? So there's a lot of trauma that is solely related to your background, which is a reality that we tend to sometimes just not look at, you know, like there's marginalized folks and BIPOC folks who are more prone to being exposed to certain types of trauma just because of how they look or our sexual orientation or how we identify in many, many different ways. And that is very important to kind of just note here. But on the other hand, I also hear, you know, that I think sometimes we have a misunderstanding around what trauma is and around what we think can be categorized as traumatic and what can't be categorized as traumatic. And here we really try to make an effort to make sure that everybody who's hearing us can understand that a simple act like being called nigger by random people when you're a young child, and then that creating a chain reaction within your family system can be considered trauma. We don't have to get to this part of which we will get into now, you know, sexual assault, death, neglect, abuse. We can also be traumatized as children, especially because, and you said it, but I want to bring it back, when we were children, we internalize everything. Yes. So things that go wrong, our parents are angry, sad, depressed, have a life, they're human beings. We as children have a tendency to internalize and think that it's us that are creating the issue and that it's our fault. And so that alone is already starting to affect how we view ourselves and how we view the world. And then you very eloquently went into how that can cause shame in a lot of us, right? Because there's inadequacy, there's shame, there's what do I do with this? I'm different. And I can imagine, you know, just that moment in your life where you're saying, wait, I knew that I was different, but being different is an issue, you know, because it's a different question. Like we can see that we're different. You and I are different. We look different. We're different people, but is it an issue?
Right. Perfect. Great encapsulation. Thank you. And you're 100% right. And I think circling back to what you said there, we don't think about how, like you said, children take in this information in so many ways and internalize it. And because we don't think of it, it's not caught early on. And so when you return to a trauma therapy lens, there's a part of us that when we think about how did your trauma, your response to trauma, your anxiety, your depression begin, well, it's what you said here. It's like, well, it's because when this event happened, everyone around me was having stuff and they projected or they were processing it while I was processing it, and I internalized their process, and it impacted me and my ability to, one, name trauma, manage the trauma, and trauma responses. And those subtle pieces are often lost and they add to our confusion. So then 30 years later, you're like, why am I so depressed about this? What's going on? Well, because this happened, you just don't remember it and it's impacted you. So you're 100% right. And I think my experience in that is very typical of a lot of particularly people of color. I think we all have those instances.
And you mentioned a very important point of living any traumatic experience that has to do with not knowing what it means and then not having the space to process that, right? So we fall, especially if it's at young ages, or not really, not often also when we're older, we go through a traumatic experience. There's a part of us that knows, well, maybe this isn't my fault, maybe it is, I'm not sure, but we don't have a space to kind of go and really process what this means for us. And that then creates a whole other issue with not being able to process that. And while you were talking earlier, it sounded like you did have a little bit of space with your family to kind of process what was happening for you at that time. And I wonder if from your own experience, you can talk to or speak to the difference that made for you, being able to talk to somebody about the experiences you were going through in your own healing. How did that affect your healing?
Great question. Thank you. And you're absolutely right. So my late grandmother, the one I've spoken about, was a social worker. She graduated from Spelman, and she had been working on what I think we'd now call her MSW. I think it had a different name back then, before World War II, which she enlisted and became a WAC, which is the Women's Army Corps, I believe, and how she met my grandpa. But anyway, because she was a social worker, she was up on the literature and aware of what we would now call, like you said, spaces to process. I don't know if she would have called it that, maybe, but she was aware of it. Her husband, my grandfather, was an artist, a graduate of Virginia State and Grey Vogue, also an academic, very much about let's explore concepts, let's explore what's going on. And my mother is a retired university professor, literature professor. So as a result, I did come from a background of people saying, let's not shut down these conversations, let's talk about them. And so I think now that you mention it, that one explains why I became a therapist, because I came from a background of like, hey, we can talk about these things. But also two, it helps me because I learned I didn't do anything wrong by asking questions. It was okay to ask questions. It's okay to explore. And actually, it's healthy to explore. And perhaps now that you're mentioning it, one of my biggest shocks is as I got older, especially in college, and I think the narratives in my family are not unique. I think a lot of people have these types of narratives, but the difference is because my family are academics and we could talk about it, a lot of people do not have those experiences. So there's a lot of internalized shame and guilt, and we just don't talk about it past the peas at dinner. And one of the things I do in a reparative way as a therapist is try to get people to have those conversations that I was naturally allowed to have as a child and a teenager, because and try to get them to do it now as a way of healing, because talking things through is a major way of healing, of approaching healing. And I think some of this too, just to say a little bit about my family origin, on my African-American side, especially my grandmas, were what we call the talented 10th. If you've read W.B.E. Du Bois or Du Bois, depending on how you want to pronounce it, I do come from that. In fact, he taught my grandmother when she was in Atlanta working on what we would now call her MSW. So I come from a very academic background. My great-great-grandpa had a university degree right after slavery. I mean, again, historical Black college, but I come from a long line of academics, and so talking and searching for knowledge is a big part of our family ethos. It also helps that we don't have a dominant religion. That's another conversation, but we're very ecumenical as a family. And because of that, I think we don't have a lot of the taboos that many religions put on talking about things, particularly if they relate to trauma, because trauma usually relates to things around sex or sexuality or identity or money, things like that. Most I think religious institutions historically have said, well, we don't talk about this. My family didn't have those particular politics, and so as a result, it was like, sure, let's just talk about this. Yeah.
I love that, and it's so important. And I think it's just, I think we underestimate the power of conversation in a lot of ways, right? And we underestimate the power of listening or hearing somebody say, hey, I know how you feel, or hey, I can hear what you're saying, at least, right? So I can hear you. I'm here for you to listen to bring that space which we're talking about, right? And then I also wonder, as your life kind of continues to progress, and you've already kind of told us, okay, well, there was more trauma, it didn't stop there. Things kept going and going and going and going. So I wonder if that at any point we don't have to get into the details of what it was, because I don't think it's important, but I do think it's important to talk about if you believe or consider that at a point that kind of thwarted or moved that kind of self-assurance of like, you know what, it's not my fault, I can continue, I'm gonna do this, I'm curious, because I'm hearing all of these positive and resilient things that came out of these first interactions with traumatic experiences, but then I wonder if that changed over time at one point or it didn't.
I see what you mean. So if I understand you correctly, you're saying basically what caused me to continue this resilient framework as interpersonal traumas occurred. Okay. As I mentioned, in college, I was harmed, and I think I broke. And like a lot of people, I very much internalized the message, because that's what abuse does. And one of the ways I internalized it was by being silent. That is the worst thing you can do, is be silent about things that were not your fault. And, when you're silent, you feel isolated and alone. And as a result, my anxiety went up the roof. I ended up changing majors. I gained a lot of weight, acne issues, a lot of things happened because I was internalizing this. And I'm in my early 40s, so it didn't occur to me back then to go to therapy. Things that we would do now that are natural didn't occur to me. But I mean, I think because I did have a strong foundation of self-belief, I didn't break maybe in the same way some people who didn't have that foundation would. So for me, what helped me heal, to go to your point, is traveling. And this is a point of privilege. I want to name that. But I said, I'm going to do study abroad. And my minor was in Japanese studies. I had a brilliant advisor in my Japanese studies program. And I said, okay, I'm going to do study abroad. So I went to the University of Kansai Gaidai in Hirakata, Osaka prefecture. And I was there and for many months. And that was the first stage in my healing, because being away, having to focus on using another language, which is hard, as you know better than I, getting used to the culture shock of what's similar, what's different, everything kind of forced me out of my trauma state and into something new. It made me focus on something else. But at the same time, I had a lot of concentrated time on my own in this new setting that was away from everything to really think and reflect. And that began my healing process. I started meeting people from all around the world, and I started learning my story wasn't just me. There were other people who had similar narratives. And that was kind of restorative to me. And then after that, I really began traveling. I graduated from college and I said, you know what, I'm just going to travel. So I ended up doing a master's. I decided to do a master's at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, which I loved. And living there, I met more international people and had more international experiences. And then I said, you know what, I'm going to do any job I can find just to travel. And I've been to 27 countries. So that's what I did in my 20s and early 30s. I just traveled. I went to school and I traveled. I visited friends everywhere. I've been to Saudi Arabia. I've been to Peru. I've been to Bolivia. I've been to all over Europe. I've been to Bangladesh. I could just go on and on and on. And the more I traveled, the more I saw, the more I learned, the more I got to understand the nature and impact of intergenerational trauma, both macroly. Like I'll never forget when I was in Peru, seeing the impact of Pizarro on the people of Lima, in particularly Afro-Peruvians. Because I was interested in groups similar to my own, as well as the indigenous folk and everyone else, seeing that, but also seeing how cultures survive, seeing Cusco's, which is the Inca capital, and how people maintain their sense of culture, maintain their sense of pride, were resilient despite this abuse, was really inspiring to me. And I saw that all around the world, no matter how many countries had been quote unquote colonized, you saw ways the culture maintained their strength, maintained their identity, didn't lose it despite the abuse, because colonization is abuse. Let's name it the way it is. And that started helping me. So over the years, through meeting people, through seeing different experiences, through getting away from the areas and the reminders, the triggers that were abusive, I began to strengthen, really accept it was not my fault, and then just find my own voice. And then when I came back to the US, I said, okay, I need to go to therapy. and I went to therapy, and I highly recommend it. I don't think anyone should do work in mental health that hasn't been to a therapist. I worry about those people who are like, oh, I don't need therapy, but I'm a therapist. I'm like, oh no, that's not okay. You have to experience this. You have to go through this. So the traveling and then my own therapy, and I had a brilliant therapist. I had two. One retired halfway through and they were wonderful. And then the second one I got was equally wonderful. So I was very lucky in that I got two amazing therapists who were not afraid of my intensity, not afraid to ask me questions, not afraid to challenge me, to push me. And it was hard work. It's like exercise. You don't want to do it, but you love the results. And at least I don't. I'm naturally like, I rather sit on the couch and eat something versus go to the.
But we're using the metaphor nonetheless. And you mentioned something very interesting, which I would like to use as an opportunity for us to kind of pivot more into this intergenerational trauma piece of the conversation. But before we go there, first of all, applauding, your capacity to find ways of being resilient, even though once you choose to be silent, you choose to, and sometimes we choose that because we really don't know what to do with what's happening, and we really feel that we don't have a choice, right? And that's very important to name as well. I do want to ask you though, because I am very curious.
Sure.
I think you spoke about, I accepted that it wasn't my fault. And I think in all traumatic healing, for everyone here who's hearing us and has gone through trauma, is walking with somebody who maybe has gone through a traumatic experience and just walking that path with them. And we come to this stage where we're okay, it's not my fault. What happened with you when you realized that it wasn't your fault?
That's a good point. I don't think it was an overnight aha moment. I think it took several years to get to that point. And I can only speak for me. I think what helped me get to the part, it was not my fault, was one, understanding the intergenerational bit. Because when you know you're not alone, I think it's easier to heal. And because of my cultures, there's a great emphasis on ancestry, and not like in a weird eugenics way, more like in a, hey, our ancestors really survived stuff so we could have a better life, in a like extended grandparent way. So knowing I was not alone really helped me. Meeting other people and understanding that, again, in this life, I'm not alone, really helps me. And then I think, and this is again my own experience, although I do see it with clients, I think there's a tendency that when we are systematically harmed, we look for a logical answer. And I think the logical answer we all default to is, I must have done something because it keeps happening to me, when that isn't the case. It's about power and control that's been foisted onto you by someone who has too much power and control in your life. And so when you're being harmed, you can't see that. So you believe it's something you did. And so then you go through this idea of, it must be my fault. It must be my fault. And so you self-punish. And then you also get messages of people telling you it is your fault. I don't want to minimalize that. I mean, you have people saying it is your fault, it's your fault. And so you internalize that too, society, individuals, a lot of betrayal trauma, people you trust saying that to you too, or ignoring it and saying, maybe they couldn't cope and they just over it, or enable the abuser. So there's a lot of factors that cause us to believe it's our fault. But I think that's also exhausting And I think to put into social work terms, I decided I needed some real self-care, which meant that I needed to not be exhausted. So as a way of providing self-care to myself, I said, okay, let me reframe this. What if it wasn't my fault? What if I had no accountability with this? What if sadly bad things sometimes happen to nice people type of thing? I said, let's just entertain that. And I started entertaining that within myself, and it felt good. And then I kept thinking, well, why do I want to assume it's my fault? If it wasn't my fault, my ancestors were brought here. It's not my fault they were forced to leave Georgia. It's not my fault that somebody harmed me. It's not my fault. I started thinking about, is it ever anyone's fault when they're harmed? And I thought, well, not really, no. And so the more I thought about it, I'm like, well, then why am I holding on to this? How does that make me feel better to believe it's my fault? And for me personally, got tired of it. So I said, you know what, I'm just going to release that. And again, through therapy, through time, I had a foundation of self-belief. I don't want to, these are all privileges. So I want to acknowledge that. Okay, everyone's healing is different. It's not a 1, 2, 3 step. But for me, that really helped. And then like all habits, both good and bad, after a certain point, you just are like, I am ready to believe this, and you start believing it. And then also just being in the field of trauma therapy, you just meet more people who've experienced traumas and are now providers, and reinforce that, yeah, it's not your fault. It wasn't my fault. And also I will say lastly too, kind of an homage to Maya Angelou, learning how to speak. Her book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Speaks, is all about her refinding her voice after her sexual assault as a child. And it's such a powerful book because she basically does what I've described. She goes from internalizing it to redefining herself to becoming the amazing person we all love. And I think that's a big point of it, knowing you're not alone and that you will be safe if you want to talk about it, if you want to say something about it, if you want to do something about it, whatever, you will be safe, returning to your ventrovagal, as it were, goes a long way. So I think that's the best way I can answer your question. Again, it's from a Lauren perspective. And I want to be honest that everyone's different, but that's how I did it.
100%. And I think what you're saying has so much power, right? Because we're talking about how do I find what works for me in my healing journey, and how do I find what I believe in and what really, really, truly just resonates with who I am. But you did touch in this wonderful piece about questioning and asking ourselves what beliefs, behaviors, ideas, what are they doing for us, right? Are they serving me? Are they not serving me? Are they causing me harm? Are they making me feel a certain way? And that is something that we can all kind of do in through our own life, right? And kind of just thinking about, also considering that a lot of these, and probably all of these, were developed because they were serving us at a certain point for whatever reason, right? And so like just kind of going through that as well. Sometimes they are serving a purpose because we're trying to protect ourselves from something. Mm-hmm. And then they stop serving us. And so it's maybe time to let go of certain things, right? And that is very important. You have mentioned ventrovagal, dorsal vagal, and sympathetic system. And I am 100% sure that not everybody who's hearing us today knows what we're talking about. So I would love to ask you if you could please give us a quick rundown of polyvagal theory in regards to what happens to our body when we are going through traumatic experiences and maybe reliving these experiences over and over in our lives.
Wonderful. Absolutely. So as in Salia, as you were saying, polyvagal theory is just a theory of how we internalize trauma, traumatic experiences within ourselves. It could be expanded to a macro system, meaning all of society, as well as us individually. So there are different stages. Ventrovagal is considered when you're in that safety zone. Like right now, I'm in my ventrovagal. I'm in a room, I'm talking to you, there isn't anything right now that's frightening or scary. So I feel relaxed and safe. That's the main thing about ventrovagal. You feel safe. But if, say, I were to leave here and almost get hit by a car, or maybe get hit by a car and have to go to the hospital, I leave that sense of safety. And that impact, that trauma of being hit by a car, puts me into systematic vagal system, which basically is where I'm scared. I've had something abruptly change, take me away from my safety, i.e. from Ventra. I'm no longer feeling safe. I am not sure what's going to happen. I've experienced a trauma. I'm trying to process all of that. Then after I've experienced that trauma and I'm processing it, often, and that process can be a long time. This isn't like, oh, you have it for a few days and you're done. It could go on for years. Maybe I'm constantly, anytime I hear the word car, I'm terrified. Maybe I'm still feeling inflammation from the accident, maybe any number of things. Maybe I'm like, oh God, what happens now when I leave my room? That's that sense of like, that uncertainty, that fear. I don't want that trauma happening again. And sometimes what happens is when something traumatic has happened, I feel like it's always going to happen and there's nothing I can do to prevent it. I go into what's called dorsal vagal, which is where I kind of get depressed, lethargic, a sense of I can't do anything. I shut down, basically. So it's like maybe after the accidents occurred, anytime I leave the room that I once felt safe in, I'm convinced I'm still going to be hit, especially if I go on the same part of the street I was hit before. So I will shut down. So maybe that shutdown would look like I don't leave my home, or I get very anxious, or I get very scared. And so it's that shutdown. And even when I leave or think about leaving, there's a sense of what's called your neuroception is up. And that's where you're like scanning for safety. Like, okay, well, if I do have to leave my home because I have to go to work or I have to go to the grocery store, I'm going to be scanning all the different ways that I could potentially be harmed so I can keep myself safe. Okay. And so when a person's experienced trauma, which is why I use that card, they often stay in that little triangle of systematic, reliving that trauma, not really getting past it, dorsal shutting down. And even if they do go out, neuroceptums are up. And I really think the neuroseptum issue is actually the most acute, because I think not everyone goes into that dorsal state or stays there. But I think what really triggers extreme anxiety among trauma survivors, regardless of the trauma, is neuroceptors are always on and there's no way of shutting it off. Kind of like our smartphones, they never really turn off. And so I think that's kind of what happens. And so the goal is really to eventually get back to that vagal state, which is that safety state. And that's why we go to therapy. That's why we also sometimes will gravitate to things that comfort us that can be harmful, like overeating or oversleeping, or maybe substance abuse or so forth. It's not like we're consciously saying, hey, we want to overindulge because that's what we want to do. We're trying to self-soothe. We're trying to provide that ventra state, that safety state, in the only way we can. And so we go to what gravitates to us. So the goal of a trauma therapist is to help you re-engage and find your ventra state. And sometimes that ventra state changes. Maybe the ventra state that you had before your traumatic incident or incidents is not the same one you'll need for healing. And so a good therapist is basically helping you identify how to get back to that ventra state and acknowledge that these experiences you've had with systematic, dorsal, and your neuroceptons always being up are always going to be with you. They don't go away, but it's about how to make them manageable so you can still get to that ventra state. And that's why therapy takes a long time. That's why you have to sometimes find different therapists. That's why, it's a complicated state to handle. So that's really how the polyvagal system theory works in a nutshell. And I use it in describing intergenerational trauma and personal trauma, because really, to me, it makes sense. It's how we process all of this.
100%. And we process this, right? Like we're going back to our most innate stimuli and responses. Our body is also reacting to what's happening to us, right? And it's not just our minds and our brains and our emotions. Our body is also being triggered by all of these experiences. So safety and danger are both a part of what this physical thing that we exist inside of is experiencing, right? So I am so curious to hear how intergenerational trauma, after your healing process kind of started and we're like in therapy and we're starting to heal and we're starting to make sense of all of these things that happened to Lauren, and all of a sudden we start making sense of the whole picture, right? And my question to you would be, how did intergenerational trauma, and how does intergenerational trauma in your own story play a role in your healing process too?
I think for me, a lot of it, like I said, was not feeling alone. I draw a lot of strength, personal strength, from knowing if my ancestors could survive this stuff, I can't. That's just my way of framing it. So when I have felt my most lowest and depressed, I thought, oh, hang on, Lauren, you had ancestors who were born and died as slaves. You had ancestors who were forced to give up their land and go to a new territory that made no sense to them just because they physically looked different to the people with guns. And so for me, when I was at my lowest, I would say, well, if people in my family could survive that and live long enough to give me the life I have, which is basically what they did, then I can endure that. So knowing that I come from people who could survive these atrocities, that strength, knowing that's in me, has been a great catalyst for how I survive things that have happened to me. And it also reminds me that, like that old cliche, life isn't fair. It isn't fair. Nobody deserved any of that. They didn't deserve it. It wasn't their fault. It should never have happened. But sadly, it did, because life is sometimes unequal. I don't know why. We could have a philosophy class on that, but it just is. So again, knowing that they knew it was unfair, and it wasn't, and hopefully knew it wasn't their fault. Don't know. These were all different people. And yet we're able to not only survive, but thrive. Our languages didn't die. Our traditions didn't die. Everything continued. Sure, they had to hide it sometimes because it was a survival technique, but they didn't die. And they lived through me and my cousins and any other generations to come. That for me, I guess, drawing more on my native side, that's medicine. That's big. So hearing the stories and knowing the stories of what people survived for me and for themselves gives me that medicine to continue now. And so that's part of why I do it. And I find with my clients that when we look at their intergenerational trauma, because the clients who see me know this is the type of work I'm doing, so they're open to it. It really helps them to say, hey, I never thought about it, but I had grandparents who survived a pogrom, if they're from European Jewish ancestry, or survived Armenian genocide, or survived atrocities in Rwanda, or whatever. I could go on. Or even immediate family members, they came here, they had to cross borders to keep me safe and keep me alive. That is a reminder that we're not alone in this journey. We have that strength in us, and we can do it. This again is my approach. I also want to say that not everyone has this knowledge. Not everyone has family systems that their family may have harmed them, so they may not be able to draw on this. In that case, a lot of my LGBTQ clients are like, my family of origin's toxic. That's why I've had a lot of abuse. So then it's like, okay, well then what can we talk about with your chosen family? What narratives can come from that lineage? What do you take away from Stonewall and how people survived that horrible event that happened to the culture? What happened? Like, we find other ways to find that intergenerational connectivity, even if it's not biological. And I find, again, the clients who see me, it works, and it helped me personally, and it works with them, because this is what I practice. It's not for everyone, that's okay, but for the people who want to do this work, I find it very useful.
And I think you touch on something so incredible that has to do with, I hear you saying changing the narrative, right? So we can stay in this part of like, life isn't fair, and we can choose to stay only there, and kind of, life isn't fair, all of these atrocities happened to me, to my family, to the people before me, etc. But we can add another element while never negating that these atrocities happen and that life truly really isn't fair. We can also add the new layer of, but they survived all of this, and that is so much more powerful, in my opinion, again, because I am not saying that everybody should be on the same boat, that love always beats fear and death and atrocities and horror, right? So it's just so beautiful to hear you kind of say that out loud as well, right? But they survived, and they brought me to where I am today, and that is awesome. It's just so awesome. And I would love to stay here and chat with you for much, much longer, but we are running out of time, and I want to be respectful of your time. So I would like to ask you two more questions.
Sure.
The first question is if there is anything else that you deem important or want to share with us today.
Sure. I think it's be patient with yourself. Being patient with yourself is a great kindness to yourself, and that's the ultimate self-care. Don't compare yourself to other people. I've shared my experiences. They worked for me. That doesn't mean it will work for everyone. It may or may not. So I would say be patient to yourself, be kind is a form of kindness. Don't compare yourself to others. Everyone experiences trauma in a different way. Everyone heals in a different way. And I always emphasize harm reduction in the sense of like, if you've taken up a habit that may not be the best for you theoretically, but it's sustaining you, that's okay. Eventually, if you want to end it, you will, but don't punish yourself by saying, oh, I should stop smoking, I should stop overeating or whatever. No, it's a process. If it's sustaining you and keeping you in Ventra, let's wean it off and try to find an appropriate replacement, but don't punish yourself for needing it still. So I think that's a big thing. And I always say that, trauma occurs in like a few minutes usually, but it's surviving the trauma that's the hardest part. So that's again why I say be very patient with yourself, be tender with yourself, hold yourself with some compassion. It takes time. And if you are in a position to look up your family origin, I would encourage you to do that. You don't need to talk to your family. Public records exist. The Newberry Library in Chicago is a great free repository to help people of any background look up their heritage. But try to look it up, because you might be surprised at how many people you're related to or share a history with who've had similar experiences. And that may give you that form of medicine you're looking for.
I love
If
that.
you're able. And definitely see a therapist. Find a therapist. Psychology today has a million therapists. Take your time, talk to them, find who fits. It's like shoe shopping, find the right shoe for you, but totally don't hold it alone. And if it's not your way, find, I guess, I don't know, a mentor, a religious leader, whatever, but find a way to get the poison out, because isolation is what harms us.
I love that. I love that. And last question for you, which is the question we ask all of our guests. What is mental health for you?
For me as a person, or me as a
For you
therapist?
as a person.
Ooh, mental health for me. Mental health for me is accepting the fact that perfection is an illusion and that it's okay to be imperfect. And in fact, not okay, it's not just okay, it's great. That's what it is for me. I don't need to be perfect. There is no such thing as perfection. No one has a perfect life. And once I fully accepted that, I was like, that's good for me. So I'm just me. And any mistakes I make, okay, I'll learn from them. I also have successes, and I have wonderful life experiences. So for me, it's just knowing that perfection is an illusion. And I don't need to be perfect. And I'm just going to be Lauren in whatever way that is. And I encourage everyone to just be themselves and don't apologize for it. Just be you. You'll be fine. You should be. And if you are in circles that people don't accept it, well, that says something about them and why it's time to find a new circle, not about you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lauren, for being here today. I really am so glad that we got to do this morning. And thank you everyone who's kindly made it to this part of our lovely, lovely conversation with Lauren. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Encamado. Bye.
Bye. I don't know how to spell. No.